Welcome, everyone, and we're delighted that you could join us this morning for us, maybe this afternoon or this evening for others. My name is Beatrice Dupuy. I'm one of the co-directors of Circle, and joining me today are Kate Mackay, Circle's Associate Director, and Chantal Warner, also co-director of Circle, will be joining us shortly. So before we start today's webinar, I have a few announcements to make. So first, let me give you some information about Circle. Circle is housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona, and it is one of 16 language resource centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education under Title VI. On this slide, you have the link to Circle's website and the link to the Language Resource Center's general website, where you can find out about the work we all do and access our free resources. So on this slide, as you can see, we have 5 webinars that are planned for this fall, including this one today. They are all listed on this slide. We have 2 in October, 1 in November, and 1 in December. And the last 3 are all based on Circle's projects, and the project directors and their team will be talking to you about their project and the materials they created. The theme of our upcoming 8th Intercultural Competence Conference, which is going to be held at the end of January, is Decentering Mobility in Intercultural Education, Engagement, Equity, and Access. We are currently working on the program, and you can find additional information on its website, which is icc.arizona.edu. So our presenters today are Dr. Emily Hellmich, who is Assistant Professor of French and Second Language Acquisition and Teaching at the University of Arizona. Her work focuses on the impact of our global digital world on language education. Her research has appeared in Teachers College Record, Calico, Foreign Language Annals, and Computer-Assisted Language Learning. And our other presenter is Dr. Kimberly Vinall, who is the Executive Director at the UC Berkeley Language Center. And in her research, she explores the relationship between languages, cultures, identities, and ideologies to explore the constructions of linguistic and cultural difference and their implication. She has published in the fields of education, applied linguistic, and second language acquisition. So without further ado, I will leave the virtual floor to Emily and Kimberly, whose webinar is entitled Translating Google Translate, Instructional Strategies for Machine Translation in the Language Classroom.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Thank you so much to Circle for their support of our project. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We're so excited to have so many of you here joining us, in fact, from 63 different countries. It's wonderful to be engaging in this important conversation with people representing so many different languages and types of institutions. My name is Emily Hellmich.
And my name is Kimberly Vinall.
The main portion of our time together today will be dedicated to instructional strategies for approaching machine translation, or MT, as we will sometimes call it, in the language classroom. For each section, we'll follow the same general organization. First, we'll briefly discuss some of the findings from our research study. Then we'll discuss the instructional strategies we recommend based on these findings. Throughout, we'll weave in opportunities for reflection and interaction, so you can continually reflect on how what we present in this webinar might apply to your own teaching and learning contexts. We will also spend some time responding to your questions, so as Beatrice said, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A as we move through the presentation. We'd like to begin, in fact, with one of these reflection or interaction components. This is a way to start to get to know each other as best we can in a webinar format and to connect with where you all are coming from. As instructors, we all have our own thoughts and beliefs about machine translation that we bring into the classroom as well as our students. To reflect on those, we'd like you to complete the following metaphor. To me, Google Translate is, or to me, Google Translate is like. So spend a few minutes thinking about how you might complete this metaphor. And when you're ready, post your metaphor to the collaborative Padlet. After a few minutes of kind of working through this, we'll come together and synthesize the ideas that come up for all of us in the Padlet. We'll spend a few minutes just looking at sort of what, as a group, what we have posted, what Google Translate, what machine translation tools like Google Translate might mean to us. A lot of different reactions and ranges. If you kind of look through the Padlet here, things double-edged sword comes up more than once. We have a friend, a fickle friend. So some of these more positive associations, but also things like a frenemy. I really like that. Something in the middle. We also have associations that are maybe not so positive. Things like cheating, an obstacle. I believe I saw a crutch. So a lot of different reactions, a lot of different relationships that we have as instructors with machine translation. Kimberly, did you want to add anything?
I was just thinking that it was interesting that in sort of some of these dichotomous constructions of Google Translate that we're seeing here, we're also seeing the role of humans. So some of them are invoking then that it's useful if there's a human involved, or so there's the relationship extends then to us and to the different ways that we use machine translation, and that some of you also referenced using Google Translation in your own lives for different purposes, to stay in touch with friends or to have access to other possibilities of engagement, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that, just to rebound off of that, what we are hoping in this webinar is that if Google Translate or machine translation has posed obstacles to you in the past, what we're hoping is that through the study that we did and through these instructional strategies, that maybe there are some additional possibilities of ways to relate, that we can relate to machine translation, Google Translate as instructors, and that we can support our students in relating to these different tools. So thank you so much for these wonderful metaphors. And we are going to come back to these at the end of the webinar. So kind of keep in mind where you're at, sort of the temperature check here. And
so before we get to those specific instructional strategies, we want to take a brief step back because the instructional strategies on how to approach machine translation in the language classroom that we're going to present today come from a research study that we conducted last summer. And the study was a computer tracking study. That is, we used digital means to observe what exactly language learners do with online tools when they're completing a writing task. So to give you a sense of where the findings come from, we're going to start off by describing in some rather broad strokes what we did in this research study. We recruited a total of 74 learners of French, Spanish, and Mandarin from several institutions. 2 were large public universities, and 1 was a community college. The learners, in the case of the French and Spanish learners, were from second semester courses, and from the third semester in the case of Mandarin. We asked our language learner participants to complete a short writing task, which you can see here, while we recorded their screen. The task was the same for all. We just modified the language in the instructions. And when the students were done, we reviewed the recording of their task completion together and asked them to retrospectively narrate their thinking and their actions, specifically focusing on these uses of the online tools. So here's a quick example of what this kind of interview sounded like and the kinds of questions that we asked.
So here I think you look up, oh yeah, the food is delicious. So what were you thinking there when you typed that in?
I think it's because
So here, Emily identified a moment of interest when the student was completing the writing task, and after playing the video clip, asked the student to narrate what they were thinking at that time. We're going to come back to this particular example a little bit later. At the very end of the session, we interviewed the students on some broader questions, which included motivations for their use of certain tools.
So with that background in mind, we're going to move to the main portion of our time together, the instructional strategies for how to approach machine translation in the language classroom. For the first section, we're going to focus on instructional strategies related specifically to training. And we're going to talk about three main sub areas: online tools for language learning, machine translation input, and machine translation output. So we found that the learners in our study from all three languages used a range of different tools as they completed their written essay. For all three languages, though, the students most often used machine translation tools. So here you have, for instance, the breakdown of tools used by learners of French, with, as you can see, 81% of the French learners using Google Translate at least once during their written essay. And here's the breakdown for learners of Mandarin. Again, a high percentage, 88% of these learners using Google Translate. And finally, here's the breakdown of tools used by learners of Spanish. You'll see, again, a high level of use of Google Translate, but also an equally high level here of Spanish Dict, which is an online tool that combines dictionary, conjugation, and machine translation functionalities. Our conversations with students after observing them using these online tools while they were working on their writing tasks, revealed some additional layers to this use of machine translation. For instance, we found that many students who used machine translation tools like Google Translate knew that the tools did not provide them the context necessary to evaluate the outcome of their search. And more than that, they wished that they had access to this kind of context. So for example, we're going to listen here to an audio excerpt from Julie, a student of French. This is during her post interview. So after her writing task and after she had talked us through her writing task. You'll first hear Kimberly asking a question and then Julie's answer.
And would there be anything that you would wish would be different about any of those platforms?
I think I wish Google Translate had more of a variety of answers that it spits out when you translate something, because I know there's a lot of ways to say one specific word or an adverb or something. And I think I've had a lot of trouble. Usually sometimes I use Google Translate and then, like I said earlier, there's one word that I'm thinking of, and then I put it into English to give me something out in French and it's not the word that I'm thinking of, and then I don't know how to find that word because it's not giving me the right translation. It's giving me the literal translation rather than all the alternatives. So I kind of wish it had more.
So here is the written quote, some of what we just heard from Julie. And to sort of summarize, what we hear from Julie is this desire for more from machine translation tools, what she refers to it as is more alternatives. We also found from our conversations with students that there were very specific reasons that they gravitated to machine translation tools. One of these reasons comes through in this audio excerpt from Eliza. So in this excerpt, this is from her post interview, Eliza is explaining to us why she doesn't always like to use word reference.
Yeah, because they only do one word at a time. And even then, let's say you put an etre. I don't know if you're a French teacher, so I don't know if you know these, but etre is just it has a lot to do with it. There's a lot of connections with that word. So because it has so many connections and different conjugations and all this, it gives you all of it. And by you plugging it in, you're clearly not sure what it's even trying to say in the first place. So for it giving you all of these different options, it's very overwhelming. And you're like, well, which one am I supposed to use? I didn't even know what this word meant, So that's why I like Google Translate sometimes, because even though it's not always the most accurate, it definitely is quicker.
So Eliza highlights here the overwhelming nature of the information provided by many non-translation tools like word reference. She refers to the different options provided by word reference as very overwhelming, and that pushes her then to use Google Translate. Students also expressed other reasons why they went to machine translation tools like Google Translate. For example, they found their textbooks often and other classroom resources to be difficult to navigate. So you have here two quotes, one from Amy, a student of Spanish, and one from Ryan, a student of Mandarin. In summary then, students rely on machine translation tools, but they also report feeling like they are either receiving too much information from these tools or not enough information from these tools. In both instances, the information is not helpful because there is not necessarily appropriate context. Some students want to be using tools that have more context, tools like word reference, but they haven't been exposed to these tools. So what this suggests to us is that students need to be exposed to and trained on both machine translation tools, but also non-machine translation tools. Google Translate is very easily accessible. It's often the very first result that pops up when students type something into their search bar. We also think that classroom time devoted to helping them understand the organization of their textbooks and how to quickly search for and find information might also be beneficial. On a related note, a big takeaway from these data is that one of the reasons students may resort to Google Translate is that they don't know how to navigate or parse the linguistic information that's provided by other tools like word reference. What students are missing, in other words, is this metalinguistic awareness, metalinguistic information that would help them to analyze the entries from different tools like online dictionaries or paper dictionaries for that matter. So we have put together some activity ideas on how to approach these two instructional strategies, and these are housed in a companion website that we are going to share with you at the end of the webinar. We're not going to pause and talk about these specific activities now, just in the interest of time, but know that they are available on the website. So if we as instructors, right, are in this position to need to train our students how to use both machine translation tools and non-machine translation tools, a really important first step is for us to be familiar with these tools. So speaking for myself, for example, it really wasn't until Kimberly and I started working on this project that I really took the time to explore Google Translate and some other machine translation tools. And this is particularly true, given that these tools are constantly updating, right? They're constantly updating with new features. I'll even sort of respond quickly to this question from Anne-Marie in the chat that these tools are constantly getting better. And Google Translate, for example, has had a marked increase in its ability to translate, improvement, let's say, in its ability to translate, particularly since it has shifted to a neural network model, and that happened in 2016. So these tools are changing, their functionalities change, but also their ability to translate is constantly in flux. So what we wanted to do was spend some time giving you the opportunity to explore tools. Time is very precious, and having a small space, a small amount of time to explore these tools so we can go ahead and train our students on them. So you can go ahead and choose any tool that you'd like. It might be a tool that you know a little bit about, but would like to know more. It might be a tool that you don't know at all. You can also choose a tool that is a machine translation tool or a non-machine translation tool. There are some ideas here on the slide that are organized by machine translation. So the tools on the left are primarily machine translation. The ones in the middle have some machine translation functionalities, but some other functionalities, and the ones on the right are moving into the more dictionary status. So I'm going to put a new Padlet into the chat. And what we'd like you to do is spend, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, take a look at one of these tools. And then when you're done, to post one thing that you learned about this tool in our shared Padlet. Thank you so much, all of you who posted, and keep posting if you're in the middle of your response. I know it's not a ton of time to explore some of these tools. But we have a lot of different tools that you explored and different things that you noticed. For example, I wanted to come to looking at, some of you, these tools were new. DeepL, for example, is a tool, a machine translation tool that's connected to Lingua. And I think I saw a question somewhere about Lingua as being, is not a machine translation. Lingua is, the primary functionality of Lingua is to offer comparative, to sort of search in comparative translation databases. But they connected now is this DeepL, which is has the neural capacities of some of these more contemporary machine translation tools. So let's see. What are we looking at here?
I might jump in for a moment just because I was
please.
noticing that in addition to exploring some tools that maybe you all weren't aware of, and I'm always surprised at how many new tools are coming out. This is where I actually learned a lot from my students. My students seem to know what things are coming out. They seem to be using things before they're necessarily on my radar. And one of the other things I also like to always do with students is sort of pull them in terms of what they're using. So I have a sense in the classroom, what may be new, what might I not be familiar with in terms of these tools, so that I know that I want to go in and explore these tools. And I also know what they're engaging with. I also noticed in many instances that a lot of you were commenting about how it's great because this tool gives suggestions, it gives alternatives. And I think for us, with sort of the knowledge that we have of the languages, this is a wonderful point of exploration. But as we're going to be highlighting, I think for students, it becomes very difficult to parse this information and to know what to do with this information and how to use this information and apply it in their own writing. So those were a couple of things I was noticing. I don't know if Emily, if you wanted to add anything more to that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you about the sort of using our students as a resource. And if you're comfortable, it can also be an opportunity for them to teach you a little bit about tools if you're comfortable asking them if a particular student has, is particularly tech savvy. I was also going to note just some of the things that I saw is, both the positives and negatives, the limitations, and that just these, brief explorations of these tools can, refine how we would direct our students to these different tools. If one is giving better context, for example, if one is working for a particular language, I think that's the other piece to make sure that these tools are functional for the languages that you teach. They certainly have, some of them have better databases for some languages versus others. So hopefully you had the opportunity to at least explore a tool and maybe learn a new one. And these slides will be available. So if there's one you didn't get a chance to look at, you can definitely check those out at a later time.
And I think we had one question, Emily, that I want to pull in from the
Sure.
Q&A, which is from Arnella Kusanar. Asking about the main differences between MT tools and non-MT tools. And so this might be a good moment maybe to respond to that.
Yeah, the main differences between machine translation tools and non-machine translation tools, let's go back to this slide here. Some tools are going to have multiple different features integrated into the same platform. So Spanish Dict is a really good example of that. They have different tabs. They have a dictionary tab. They have a synonyms tab. They have a conjugation tab, I even believe, and they also have machine translation. And so you can get tools that sort of offer multiple functionalities. But the machine translation versus non-machine translation, machine translation at its heart is using a tool, a platform, in the case of current online machine translation tools, using an algorithm to translate text from one language to another. And that is different than something like a word reference that is an online dictionary, essentially, that's offering examples or depending on the tool, is offering the different types of possible definitions, more or less, for different phrases or words. And again, like Lingua is another example of a tool that's sort of in the dictionary realm, but that also offers examples of comparative translations at the bottom. If you ever use Lingua, at the bottom are those sort of comparative. So hopefully that's a helpful. Anything to add to that, Kimberly, on the difference between the two?
Nope, I think that's great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, great questions. And yeah, keep them coming. We are happy to stop and answer as we move through. So we'll go back to looking at some more instructional strategies. So we talked about training for online tools, both machine translation and non-machine translation tools. Another area where we think our research can inform instructional strategies on how to train students around machine translation focuses on machine translation input. So what students put into machine translation platforms. So we found that, again, looking at our 74 participants across all of our students that we talked with, students most often input words into machine translation tools. They less often put in phrases, and they least often put in entire sentences. These trends hold up for all three of the languages that we looked at. So here you have the trends for learners of French. So 57% of their input was at the word level, 26% at the phrase, and then 16% at the sentence level. The same again, we see the same for Mandarin, even less at the sentence level and even more at the word level here. And finally, learners of Spanish, which closely mirrored the trends that we saw in French. Unfortunately, though, this approach, this putting in single words into machine translation tools often gets students into trouble. So when students search word for word, the machine translation tool does not have enough context. So machine translation tools define context as sort of needing more around a single word to identify a more appropriate translation. And so when you only put in one word, students often will get really wonky results. An example of this, I'm going to show a series of screenshots from a student, Masha, and she frequently used machine translation to look up words. And what she's wanting to do is to complete the sentence, "There are a lot of cities near Phoenix." So what she does is she types the word, single word, near, in English into Google Translate, and she gets the French word près. And she goes ahead and puts that into her composition document, more or less as is. She does get the accent wrong. But what's the problem here is that she's missing a vital preposition. That one word did not translate properly, and she's missing a preposition, de, in the final sentence that leads to an error in her text. This is another example that we'll watch from a student named Meg, and this is a video clip of her completing her mini essay in Spanish. So Meg is looking, as you can see, is looking for the word place, and she chooses puesto instead of sitio or lugar, which would have been more correct options. And interestingly, though, Meg, she does make an effort. She reads through the examples. She's recognizing the importance of context, but in the end, she does not choose the correct word. But if Meg had put more into Google Translate, as we have done here, she would have been given puesto as an option for places. We also found that there was more to the story when it came to sentence level input, right? So when students put in full sentences, we found the story to be a bit more complicated than just copy pasting. To demonstrate this, I'm going to show you a video of a student of French, Sasha, as she's completing her writing task. All right, so we'll actually come back to this example in a second to give you a bit more of how Sasha's working with these sentences. But as you can see, Sasha, she is indeed putting in whole sentences to machine translation. But what she's doing is she's putting in whole sentences that she has written herself in the target language. And then she's going through sentence by sentence, looking at the English output as a way to check her own work. Importantly, though, machine translation is not good at this type of activity. It's not able to identify the errors in her French text very well. So another issue with sort of the input that students are putting in being problematic for what they get. So what you put into machine translation tools matters a lot for what you get out of it. For our language learners, it's important that we're alerting them to these limitations by training them specifically on what to include, and most specifically, how to add in sufficient context. So a relatively straightforward way to do this would be to show students how very similar searches can produce very different results using machine translation tools. So for example, with French, I might show novice students this set of results from Google Translate, emphasizing what you get for each type of input. So what happens when you add an article, when you use the verb. You could think about phrases that might work for you for the specific languages that you teach. And the key here, the reason why fly in French works so well is that it showcases the multiple possible translations. So might be, that there are a range of different kinds of words or phrases that you might be able to key your students in to show this kind of this comparison. But you could also ask students to do this kind of comparative work on their own and then come back together to discuss as a class. So, giving them a set of words and asking them to go investigate what happens when they alter the input slightly. And these are some sort of discussion questions that you might include, might ask students to engage with. What happens when they include or exclude adjectives, articles, subjects, pronouns, things like that. Again, all these activities are going to be available on the website that we'll come back to and give you the link to at the very end of the webinar.
I'm just going to jump in for a moment, if that's
Please.
Okay. I wanted to clarify with the videos that we're playing, just a couple of things in terms of the sound, because there were some questions. We're playing two types of videos. One is from the students actually completing the task, in which there is no sound other than perhaps you'll hear the clicking of them typing. Some of the videos are from that recall where we're asking them retrospectively, what were you thinking? And in that case, then there is sound that would accompany the videos. So I wanted to point that out. And I also wanted to pick up a question from Kier Garcia about the accuracy of these translation tools, because I think this is a nice moment to weave that in, because what we're seeing here in terms of this question of accuracy is that a lot depends on what you're inputting into the tool itself in terms of the accuracy. And so I just wanted to come back and highlight that. And I don't know if Emily, if you wanted to tag on to that, anything?
No, I mean, I think that's it's very relative, right? It's relative to what you put in and what you're hoping to get out. I think there was a question earlier, perhaps, questions about proverbs, about metaphors, about, that is a type of input that historically machine translation has not been very good at doing. It's getting better to be, it's with the neural networks that have been driving a lot of machine translation tools in the last 5 to 6 years. It is getting better, but again, it's the input and if whether or not you're looking for something that's a translation like word for word, or if you're looking for something that's going to be more pragmatically appropriate for a particular context. So that's what I would add on to that. The flip side, of course, to talking about machine translation input is talking about machine translation output. And of course, they're very interconnected. So it's sort of a false distinction to pull them apart, but we will talk now more about the output, what comes out of machine translation tools, and how we might be able to think about some instructional strategies focused specifically on this output. So we found that students, in some cases, that some students did not analyze. They did not engage with the output of machine translation tools. So coming back to that example from Masha as she completes her task, this is the video of her completing her task. So again, you see here that Masha does not pause to review the output of her search. She inserts the output sort of directly into her composition document. And again, the issue here is that she's missing preposition. Across all of our participants and all of their uses of machine translation, we found that students did not analyze the results in about half the time. However, we also found that in the other half, approximately, of the instances of machine translation use, students did spend time engaging with the output of machine translation tools. So we looked to describe this engagement in a couple of ways. The first was to look at how much time students were spending reviewing machine translation output. So on average, across all of the students that participated in our study, they spent about 14 seconds reviewing the output of machine translation tools. Another way that we can describe how students analyze the output is to categorize the different approaches that they took. So one approach that we saw with students was to cross-reference the output of the machine translation tool. So we're going to come back to the example we started earlier with Sasha. So Sasha, remember, is looking at what she'd written in French and looking at the English translation of that. She's not happy with with the output, so she goes to another Google Translate window to look up a different piece of information. She said in her recall, something didn't look quite right, and so she wanted to cross-reference that with a different search. Here's another example of a student analyzing the output of machine translation in interesting ways. This video is from Jason as a student learning Mandarin. And the video starts off with Jason inputting a sentence that he wrote in Mandarin into Google Translate and then looking at the English output. So Jason does several things here. He looks up the word that he's having trouble with and he translates it individually. He then looks at the different translation options that Google Translate provides, tries one of those, but he's still not satisfied. So then he goes to a different site, an online dictionary, and he goes through different options. He selects one, he reads through the entire entry, and then he rechecks that character from the dictionary in Google Translate. So some really complex analyses, some really complex processes going on here. In the case of our study, so we documented the student engagement with machine translation in terms of both how long they were spending with tools, but also how exactly they were engaging with the output of machine translation tools. So This documentation suggests that we really can't assume that all of our students are just copy pasting into their composition documents. It also suggests a possible intervention, as we can use the examples that we've seen here to think about how to train students to analyze machine translation results. As we'll demonstrate, this training could include modeling cross-referencing of machine translation output across different online tools and looking for examples in online tools to ensure the correct context. These strategies, they run contrary to the narrative that machine translation is quicker that you often will hear from students, because they both involve additional time, but it is time that many students are already spending. It's just supporting them in making that time spent a little bit more effective. So one approach to training students on how to best analyze the results of machine translation is to model how to seek additional information or context to make a decision, and then to ask students to practice this kind of work on their own. So, a simple worksheet like this, where they are asked to cross-reference a target word or phrase, could be given to students. And this last column, just to note specifically, this last column asks them to engage in a reflection, to justify what they chose and why. This discussion could be something that's brought back into the classroom, where the instructor can affirm or not the accuracy of the results, or to add additional shades of meaning that were not accounted for by the online tools. You could also think of something along the lines of this worksheet. This is an activity and worksheet created by some colleagues at the University of Arizona, Ryu, Kim, Yang, Sanyang, Park, and Chung. And what they ask students to do is to guide them through sort of the use of online tools, to ask them to clarify the purpose of their search. So are they looking for spelling or grammar, for example? And then to document what they find via cross-referencing in some interesting places. Like, so for example, doing an image search. What does your image search help you see about whether or not your translation is correct? The last step is also reflective. It asks students to engage in a guided reflection on their analyses. And this is both at the level of language, comparing and contrasting the translated parts with the student's own writing, as well as on the tools themselves and what they were able to learn. If you're interested more in this approach, this comes from a larger article that Ryu and colleagues put together for a special issue of the L2 journal that Kimberly and I are editing. That issue will be coming out later this year or early next year. The activity, this activity link is also on the website that we'll be sharing at the end of the presentation. We also like to highlight a series of questions that our colleagues Lindsay Myers and Stephanie Pellett created, also from this upcoming special issue, and also available on the website. These questions were created as a cycle to help students decide if and how to use online tools. The questions are in 3 phases, and the last phase is the one that really focuses on what we're talking about here, which is asking students to review what it is that came out of machine translation tools. For example, is the output conjugated appropriately? Does it integrate well into what I'm saying? So again, sort of a series of guiding questions to support students and to counter this narrative that machine translation is quicker.
So another area where we think our research might inform how we as instructors approach machine translation is how we think about and structure assignments themselves. So adding to the list of reasons why students use machine translation that we started earlier, we found that time and grade pressures were also central reasons that students use these tools. So for instance, we have 2 quotes here from 2 student participants. And what we see is that both spoke to time being a factor in using machine translation. Their impression that machine translation tools produce results faster, even if those results weren't always to be trusted. In addition to time, grades were also a factor in using machine translation. So Gabby, for instance, admitted that she would have used Google Translate to look up a particular word if the assignment had been graded because, and I quote, Those fun vocabulary words make writing more interesting and more advanced. And obviously that's better when you are trying to go for a better grade. And Meili had a similar view, tying high grades to her perception of the fancier words that machine translation produces. So if students are in a hurry, they may be less likely to engage with machine translation outputs by analyzing them in all of the different ways that Emily has just highlighted in the last section of our presentation. It is wonderful, of course, when students use and learn new vocabulary words, fancy or not, through machine translation use. However, we think that shifting the motivating factor away from grades might make learning more meaningful rather, and invite more creativity and play into the process. We propose 3 possibilities: create open-ended assignments, implement low-stakes scaffolding, and create evaluations that do not solely focus on grammatical correctness. So here you see an example of a rubric that Emily uses in an advanced language course. And I know that you're not going to have time to read through it all thoroughly now. So I just want to mention that it is available on the website that we'll be demonstrating for you later. So you can go back and take a closer look at this rubric. But what we wanted to call your attention to is sort of the highlighted portion. Because what we can see in that highlighted portion is that the language component is worth 40% or 40 points rather of the entire grade, which is less than half of the total points of the assignment. And then in half of those 40 points is in fact focused on comprehensibility and not grammatical correctness. And here's another example of a rubric. This example comes from our colleagues, Vera Klekokina and Lawrence Dene Higney, from their manuscript, which is another manuscript that is included in the upcoming special issue that Emily mentioned earlier. So this particular rubric is for an oral debate scoring. And like the previous one, it doesn't focus exclusively on grammatical correctness. Instead, it centers on the content and the primary features of the genre, establishing a position, providing supporting claims with examples and facts, and responding to counter arguments while maintaining appropriate tone and eye contact. So again, this rubric is also available on that website that we'll be showing you shortly if you want to go back and take a deeper look at this particular rubric. So another area where we might adjust our assignments relates to the goals and the structure of the assignments that we give. And to consider these adjustments, we want to take a step back for a moment because we found that students understood machine translation tools in very different ways. And actually, some of these ways reflect some of the ways that you also understand and relate to machine translation tools that we saw at the Padlet at the beginning when you answered that sentence or completed that sentence, machine translation is like. So because the students understand these machine translation tools in different ways, they also use them in different ways. And so understanding these differences is helpful, I think, to think about how to alter the goals and structures of our assignments. So for example, on one end of the spectrum, some students thought about machine translation as an answer key, as you can see here from this quote from Anne. She sees Google Translate as able to give the answer. For those who see machine translation as an answer key, there seems to be less interaction with the output because that output is accepted at face value and it is assumed to be correct, which also means that there might be fewer opportunities for learning. Other students, like Tia, looked at machine translation as a way to verify or check what she had written. In this clip that we're going to watch now from Tia's retrospective recall, you can hear her talking about her strategy for looking up the phrase "a Latin city." You'll see her copying and pasting a sentence she wrote into the machine translation platform, and she assesses the results. And you'll also hear her then narrate that process.
And then I was trying to say Latin city, and I always mess up because it's not like English where you write in, you know, the words go in different places. So I kind of knew that I was off there, and I had to switch some words around. So I just wanted to check
Wonderful.
and that I was missing something because I knew it wasn't just going to be Latin. But I kind of do a guess and check thing rather than just putting it straight in because I don't want to just, you don't really learn that way. So I'd rather kind of test myself than just ask it straight away.
So Tia calls her strategy a guess and check one, arguing that otherwise you don't really learn. So, and I quote, "I'd rather test myself than ask it straight away," end quote. Just like we saw with Anne, there's an interesting personalization of machine translation. Students ask it gives answers. In both cases, machine translation is seen as a source of knowledge. It is able to provide information that is right or wrong, and the focus remains squarely on the linguistic form. And as an additional little note, for those of you that speak Spanish, you'll note that Tia's effort here didn't quite work because the Spanish that she edited still isn't correct, which is another example then of how machine translation really isn't very good at translating student written texts. At the other end of the spectrum, some students, like Mary, looked at machine translation as a learning tool. So for her, this learning happens as she constructs her sentences from the small words that she looks up. She is the agent here, not machine translation, and the focus is not as much on what is right or wrong based on linguistic form, but on learning itself by trying things out and learning how to fit things together. So if we want to foster in students this latter relationship with machine translation, using it as a learning tool and not as an answer key, and if we want to emphasize language learning as communicating ideas and negotiating meanings, as opposed to being about a linguistically correct input and output, then in addition to shifting grading policies and highlighting a process approach, an additional strategy might be to shift the focus of assignments to meaning making over fill in the blanks. And a good example of this comes from our colleagues who we've already mentioned, Vera Klekovkina and Lawrence Dene Higney. Vera's students here engaged in a debate on major themes from a literary text. To prepare them to debate these complex topics in the target language, Vera had her students complete an argument map, which you'll see here on the left. The idea was to support students in the preparation of their ideas, the actual arguments they would use in the debate. In this preparation, students were allowed to use machine translation, but again, the focus is not on producing linguistically correct language, but on constructing and communicating their arguments. On the right side is the rubric that we saw a little while ago, and that again highlights not linguistic accuracy, but the genre-specific features of an oral debate, such as providing reasons and support. And again, these two documents are located on that website that we'll be showing you if you want to go back and take a deeper look.
So I might jump in quickly here just to answer a quick question from Aziz, who asked whether or not, given this perpetual evolution of tools like Google Translate, how do we approach our instructional materials that, do they need to be revised or updated year to year? And I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that I think this sort of looking at training our students or sort of approaching machine translation from the perspective of assignments is one that is a bit more sustainable, right? So these assignments will not be as influenced by the updating, the evolution of tools like Google Translate. However, given that I also think the training piece is important, I think one way to answer that is to bring those discussions into classrooms where students are actively engaging in the analysis of tools with you. So you're not having to go back and update slides, but that you're sort of discovering together the different approaches, the different functionalities and of the different tools. So I hope that that helps with that answer.
So we do want to pause here again to give you a chance to digest some of the information we've presented so far, and to think about what it might mean in your own teaching and learning context. So for this reflection, we'd like you to identify sort of one action item that you'd like to implement in your classroom based on what we've discussed so far. And we're going to use a Padlet again, and we're going to drop that Padlet into the chat. And we're going to have a couple of minutes to think and to respond and to identify what this action item might be for you. Thank you all so much for contributing these ideas. We're seeing lots of different things showing up, some of them related to sort of our feelings around Google Translate and our own relationships with machine translation tools. Some of them related to this idea of wanting to explore more these different tools to understand their capabilities, because as for us as instructors to understand these capabilities, it helps us to be able to train students how to use these tools and how to explore the use of tools. The uses of variety of tools is also showing up here. This idea of cross-referencing that we saw so many of the students in our study doing, where they're already using different tools and double checking and looking at different places in order to cross-reference information. Thinking about the question of the input. What is the input that we're going to be encouraging students? What input are we going to be encouraging them to use? Single words, the question of context, and how much we need to be able to assure that context. And Emily, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to, that stands out to you.
No, I think that was a great summary. I think just the one thing that will kind of push us into the next section is this idea of where our students are coming from. That open discussion, what are they using? How do they feel about it? As we'll talk about in the next section, our students, just as we do, have a lot of feelings about machine translation. And so I think opening that dialogue with students is always really important. So thank you for all of your great responses here.
As we move back into the PowerPoint then in this last section, I'd actually seen a couple of questions. I think I saw one, Elizabeth Deifel, that you had popped in one about policies, and we're finally getting to the policy section. And so hopefully this section will be maybe at least a partial response to your question. So this is the final area where we think our research can inform how we as instructors deal with machine translation, and that's our policies with regards to machine translation. We were surprised to learn that students frequently tied their use of machine translation tools to their instructors' policies. Often this was about using machine translation as a dictionary, as many students expressed it, meaning that they only input single words into the machine translation tools. So here, for example, we have an excerpt from Elisa's post-interview where she is explaining to us how she uses Google Translate.
And I only know that because my teachers are always like, do not use it, it's not going to be right. So instead of even risking it, I always just try to do it like what I have learned, because at the end of the day, they say you'd probably be like your grade would be punished more if you use Google Translate versus what I taught you, even if it's not correct. So that's why I do it word for word. But
so you see and hear here the confluence of teacher policies around machine translation, concerns about grades, and the result, how the student used machine translation, which in this case was word for word or looking up individual words at a time. As we saw earlier, though, inputting individual words into machine translation is actually not a very effective strategy due to the lack of context. This impact of teacher policies also apply to full sentences. So here we have a quote from Kendrick, and here he's explaining why he decided to delete a full sentence from Google Translate and replace it with a phrase. teacher rules around what is acceptable machine translation input can limit potential learning opportunities, as in this example from Sonia during her retrospective Think Aloud. So here we're going to hear an interaction between Emily and Sonia, the participant.
So here I think you look up, oh yeah, the food is delicious. So what were you thinking there when you typed that in?
I think it's because I didn't know how to say delicious, and then I realized, like, I don't know, my entire mindset whenever I'm using Google Translate is like I can't use anything that like I should not have already learned, you know?
So is that
I'm gonna get into like trouble. So I try to like
Yeah.
make it really simple.
Got it. So is that why you changed the very good here?
Yeah.
So Sonia is very clear that she doesn't want to get into trouble for using anything that she doesn't know, which is why she changes her input to very good from delicious. However, delicious is a cognate in French, one that I'm not going to try to pronounce because my French pronunciation is not up to par. Rather than using and potentially learning this new word, Sonia errs on the side of caution and she replaces it with a simpler input. Very good. So we as teachers frequently ban the use of machine translation, or we ask students to only use it for single words, what the students called using machine translation as a dictionary. We see here that there is a direct connection between these teacher policies around machine translation and how students actually use it. However, as we've seen, using machine translation for single words is not really an effective strategy due to the lack of context, which in many cases leads students to commit errors because machine translation does not always provide alternatives or sufficient examples to help students to understand those finer shades of meaning or even language use. At a broader level, using machine translation as a dictionary can potentially limit learning opportunities at the level of language itself, as well as at the level of metalinguistic awareness and meaning making. So based on this data, we suggest that instructors revise their policies, specifically avoiding bans on machine translation and this use of machine translation as a dictionary. Instead, as highlighted before, we suggest that instructors redirect their energy toward training students how to use machine translation and other online tools by teaching them how to look for examples or cross-referencing machine translation outputs, for example, as we saw earlier in the presentation. And finally, pulling together much of what we talked about previously, we suggest reframing machine translation as an opportunity for learning and de-emphasizing machine translation as an answer key in order to encourage its critical use. To further expand opportunities to consider the role of context, to explore understandings of fine shades of meaning, and to reinforce metalinguistic awareness might require opportunities in the classroom to reflect on machine translation use. For example, one of the participants in this study wanted to find a word in French for home, a word that would contain all of the emotions that she attached to it in English. Yet, using the online tools, she was not able to find anything. By noting these moments in a journal and bringing them into the classroom could occasion an in-class discussion that would reflect on why. What meanings does she attach to the word home? How could these meanings be expressed in French? And would a Francophone speaker recognize these meanings in the same way? So we've covered a lot of ground today. And as we now begin the process of wrapping up, we want to introduce you to that webpage that we referenced earlier so that we can look at it together for just a couple of moments. And this is the website that houses the different resources that we talked about. And we're just going to spend a couple minutes reviewing its organization and content for you. So there are different ways to navigate the website. You can navigate here through this home page, and you can see here the links to the different sections, the about, the research, the instructional strategies, and the additional resources. There is, in addition, a drop-down menu that you can also use in order to navigate to the different sections of this web page. You can take a closer look at the research itself and the findings that we highlighted here today on this page. And then we also have an instructional strategies section that includes then an Instagram here, or an infographic here that sort of provides a detailed description of the ideas that we've presented in the individual sections. And then you'll be able to have access to the different activities and examples that we talked about today, plus some additional ones that we didn't quite have the opportunity to talk about today. And the final thing you'll find on this website then are some additional resources, including some of the publications that we've authored, as well as the Padlets from our set time together today that we've been working on. So we're going to move into a brief question and answer session, because I see that there are lots of really wonderful questions that have come in through the Q&A. Just before we do that, we started today with this metaphor of Google Translate. To me, Google Translate is, or Google Translate is like. And we would encourage you to think about your response at the beginning of our session today, and whether or not that response at the end of our session now, if that response would be different to you in any way. Has anything changed in terms of your understanding, your own relationship to Google Translate? We also want to note that this is an exercise that we've used with students as well, as a way of opening up a discussion around Google Translate, what they understand machine translation to be like, what their relationship is to machine translation. And so using this in the classroom can also open up some spaces for some really important dialogues with students about these relationships and about our own relationships to Google Translate and machine translation more broadly. And I think, Emily, we're ready to move into some questions and answers.
Yeah, I think so. Just one last thank you to Circle. I'd also like to give a big thank you to our graduate students who were so helpful in working through this project, Wen and Daniela Torres. So thank you so much to them. So, and thank you to you all. And yes, we'll move to some questions now. Thank you so much. I wanted to, just because we were coming off of the assignment there, talk a little bit about, the policies, whether or not, a couple of you, Elizabeth and maybe Sandra as well, whether or not our students are doing other things, right, when we're not watching them. I think that's probably likely true. If you study something, you're going to impact it, as the old adage goes. So I think what we have is we can see how students are using these tools when they know someone is sort of looking over their shoulder. And it's certainly, it's just one instance, right? It's just a little slice. So I think the next step in the research here is to look at how students are looking or using these tools when they're in their home environment, when they're working on assignments for class that work for grades. And so I think, yes, the policies are likely affecting students differently when they know someone's watching, but that's sort of where we're at with the research at this point. So thank you for those two questions, Sandra.
And just to jump in on that, I also think at the same time, though, given the sophistication of the strategies they were using, I don't think that sophistication suggests that they were just doing it in that moment because they were being recorded. Yeah. And so I think that really speaks to the fact that students are in many instances engaging with these tools on their own in complex ways. One of our goals has been to just try to understand these different ways and how to better support them.
Yeah, absolutely. I really completely agree. And sorry if it came off that way. I do think that students are, they have these really sophisticated strategies, and that in no way should take away from that. So yeah, absolutely. Let's look at another question here.
I was just noticing that Magda Madkour was asking about providing students with MT tools and asking them to choose the most appropriate one for the assignment versus specifying which tools they should use. And I think both of those might be interesting strategies, especially if in thinking about the particular design of the activity, as well as the learning goals of the activity, it might be easy for you to identify. I think this machine translation tool would be, the best one or the easiest one or the most helpful one for this context. versus in other cases where it may be more open. I think one thing I like to do is sort of make these decisions transparent with the students, though, because if my goal is for them to want to understand how to use these tools, where to go for this information, to have that discussion around, in this assignment, we are working with this, therefore I feel like this tool is going to be the most helpful to you to help make those connections for them, so that in other assignments, when they're working on their own without that guidance, they're able to make those decisions for themselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Natalie brings up a good question here about what training might look like for classes that are asynchronous, classes that are online, students that have these tools available just by sort of browser open on the side. I do think that there would need to be some sort of localization, if you will, sort of some shifting of your training to account for that, and even maybe anticipating that students may have browsers open in class, in sort of as they're working, and so I think thinking about thinking really methodically about how a student in an asynchronous course might operate differently with the content, and what kinds of things would you want to provide them. So for example, asking students to incorporate pauses, right? So if the pause isn't necessarily available because they can kind of rely on any tool at any moment, helping them to incorporate a pause in reflecting on their own knowledge in their process might be something to support them with that.
And there were a couple questions that seem related to the study itself. Melinda Bailey had asked about research conducted on writing prompts in the target language versus instructions in English, since we did in this study, in fact, provide the instructions to them in English. I'm not aware of a study in which the writing prompts were provided in the target language. So that might be an interesting follow-up area of research. And someone else had asked, and I'm trying to get back down to it, about Perla Garcia asked about how they recorded their screens. I assume that was in the context of this study. And in that case, we were using, we collected data on Zoom, and students were sharing their screen with us. And then we were using a Screencastify technology to record their everything that they were doing on their screen as they were completing the prompt. And then we were able to use that Screencastify recording to immediately share it back to the student and do the stimulated recall with them with that recording immediately after they had finished.
I'll take a stab at this question from Aziz about, do you see MT tools as something for students to become fluent in and to continue to rely on, or to eventually learn how to mediate their language use without them? That's a really good question. I think I would say, I'll speak for myself as an instructor. I would say I tend to think of these as tools that students will use throughout their trajectories as language learners, but that they will rely on in different ways as they become more proficient and more comfortable in the language. I don't necessarily see machine translation as a crutch, as some might label it, but as like a tool that will morph in relationship to their needs. But I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Kimberly, or give us your take too. That might be sort of instructors and students, sort of their purview, their decisions on how that tool will move forward with students.
And that would be interesting to think about the use of machine translation across programs and across levels in terms of consistency, in terms of introducing, exploring, and building in the subtleties and the layers of what they might be able to do. with machine translation tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good, another important area of research moving forward is not just sort of what students are doing in other contexts, but also what strategies and approaches that they use with tools as they advance through different courses. I think that is a really interesting and important area of study that I know folks are actively working on. So we look forward to that research as well.
I was just going to mention that Sarah Cotelli, interestingly, is reporting finding similar results in a study in Switzerland. And wondering if it's due to the students treating MT tools like dictionaries. And again, going back to this question of teaching them how machine translation works, it would be interesting as an intervention to have some data to track what that would look like long term over a course of a semester of learning in a course where machine translation training is included consistently throughout the course. So, and speaking again to, there's lots of areas of future research that are coming up that we find very exciting and very interesting. And we certainly hope to continue this type of conversation and continue exploring those other areas.
All right. I think we have, thank you so much. We've reached the end of this webinar, and I want to thank our presenters for giving us such an interesting presentation on the insights that they gathered from their study, how they use these insights to design activities and provide strategies for how to use these tools with students and really guide them in using productively these tools, which are not going to go away anyway. So thank you also to our participants for raising such interesting questions. And please remember that on October 29 at 4 p.m., our local time here in Arizona, Circle is going to be hosting its second webinar in some way related to artificial intelligence and language teaching and learning. So thank you again, and have a great rest of the week, and we hope to see some of you on October 29.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.